Welcome. I'm Dr. Sherry Colby from Texas A&M University Commerce, Associate Professor of Curriculum and Instruction. I teach in our secondary ed master's program as well as in our doctoral program and I teach qualitative methodologies. I'm passionate about historical thinking, about teaching and learning, authentic social studies, as well as topics such as historical memory, historical empathy, and historical narratives. And it's that final concept, historical narratives, that I'm going to be visiting with you about today. I've put together a three-part lecture series with short little nuggets that you can digest in whatever busyness you have going on in your lives. The first part, we're going to focus on understanding historical narratives just as an introduction to provide some foundational ideas and to bring you into the topic. The second part will be on the philosophies associated with historical narratives and really a better understanding of what historical narratives are. And then the final piece will be the application of historical narratives, specifically what it means to think narratively in history as associated as well with the ideas of memory. And then finally, the writing of historical narratives, especially as we interact or we teach students to interact with primary sources. I'm going to start off by telling a story. Now, the story that I'm about ready to tell deals with Texas history and a group of seventh graders that I was actually teaching. In talking about Texas history, I realize that I'm talking to an audience all over the world. And so I just simply use this as an example of that is illustrative of the concept of historical narratives and some of the ideas that I'm going to be sharing with you. So I was teaching a seventh grade class on the Texas Revolution, and the Alamo. Now, these were not my own students. I was basically doing a research study in a seventh grade Texas history classroom, and the teacher in the school had allowed me in to do this work. And I had passed out a set of primary sources from the actual Alamo, diaries, journal entries, letters, a variety of different even some images that were more artistic kinds of images and things that I was having the students look at. And as the students were examining the primary sources, a group of girls jumped out of their chairs and began singing the very well-known 1950s song on Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, that Fess Parker starred in. Now, I don't know if you've heard that song, but that song goes something like, Davy, Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier. Now that song, they were pretending that they had on a coonskin cap and that they had old Betsy with the famous gun, and they were actually physically reenacting the 1950s Walt Disney TV series. The images that I'm showing you here are from the comic book series on Walt Disney's with Fess Parker's Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier. And you can see in these images here this depiction of Davy Crockett as the Indian fighter. And then he goes out to the Alamo for this call of arms to help liberate the Alamo from the oppressive Mexican army and the oppressive dictator Santa Anna. And here in this one image here, he has his old Betsy, his trusty gun, and he's ready to ride off into the sun for this new adventure. Now, what's interesting here is the comic book and the TV series communicated particular narratives or a particular story about the Alamo and about the Texas Revolution that most likely, and I can pretty much say, does not really match the actual history or what we think, based upon the best information we have, actually happened at the Alamo in 1836. Nevertheless, it communicates a narrative. The actual physical monument of the Alamo, which by the way has gone through various different changes over time. The Alamo itself tells a commemorative history that lives in the minds of Texans and Americans and really arguably even people from around the world who come to see it. So whether it's the actual movies, the comic books, and by the way, there's been a variety of films that have been done on the Alamo, whether it's in the memorabilia that I see all the time throughout the state of Texas, advertisements for going to see the Alamo, the commercialization of going to see San Antonio and the various different sites. Even here in Texas, in the Dallas area where I live, when one gets off the airplane, there's a very well-known hotel called the Gaylord Texan. And this hotel actually has a physical Alamo replication on the inside. And many of these students who participated from this study are familiar with the Gaylord Texan. They know about this physical replication, and they know about it as a major scene, an icon in the Dallas area. And so the Alamo lives on and has lived on in many different forms, and each of these physical or media or video representations tells a different narrative about the Alamo, about the Texas Revolution, and what actually happened. My work on historical narratives is rooted in the philosophy of Paul Ricoeur and his well-known text, Time and Narrative, and then his second well-known book, Memory, History, and Forgetting. Now, both of these books, the first, Time and Narrative, establishes his ideologies about narrative as related to both fictional and historical narratives, and the second one really focuses on the idea of history as a form of memory, with the idea that narrative is the way in which history is remembered and structured. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But there are some things, some narratives in the historical past that we remember better than others. There's some things that are forgotten, events and people that have been forgotten, maybe because of missing primary sources, perhaps because there may be other reasons that we may be choosing not to remember those narratives. And then there are narratives like the Alamo that are transformed and changed over time and perhaps take on a larger than life or a even cultural form of memory that influences the way people see and perceive. In crafting the historical narrative inquiry model, in essence, what I did is I took the idea or the process of historical inquiry that was familiar to historians, and I added the concept of narrative. And I based that on the work of Paul Ricoeur and his philosophy of historical narratives. And what I was seeking to do was to really emphasize a few points. First of all, obviously that there's an inquiry process that we can bring students into, that their interests and ideas and questions should drive the investigation process. The other thing I really wanted to emphasize is this section here that says secondary source analysis. And by the way, you should have a PDF copy that you can use to follow along that's much easier to see than the image that's here. The secondary source analysis, as I'm emphasizing here that I want to bring students into different secondary sources or the actual histories that historians have written, I'm including in that narratives that are not necessarily what we would call historical. In other words, I would encourage students to be exposed to the comic books and to the films and to the commemorative pieces so they can draw comparisons between the primary sources and what's actually being represented culturally and commercially about the Alamo. So part of what I was doing here is I was wanting to emphasize that narrative shapes our collective consciousness about the past, our historical memory, the way in which we see and perceive. And we want students to be wise, to act as wise judges of the narratives that they encounter and be able to use here in this section here on primary document analysis, to be able to use primary sources and examine those sources in a meaningful way and then co-compare those sources and construct through their own reasoning powers historical narratives rooted within the actual documents or based upon the actual documents they studied. So this section here on student authorship was extremely important to me. The students had a place to share and communicate their narratives, whether they be in written form, they be in digital form, such as digital documentaries, digital historical museum displays, a variety of different ways that historical narratives can be constructed, that they actually had an audience, they had a place to communicate those narratives, and ultimately those narratives should be philosophical and argumentative in nature, that even though they're written in narrative form, they still have philosophical and argumentative underpinnings that communicate particular messages, ideas, themes that are embedded within the narrative that communicate the student's perspective about the historical past. In closing, I just want to emphasize that narratives about history are everywhere. And when we understand that, we can then teach our students to be wise thinkers about the narratives that they encounter. In our next part, we'll talk a little bit about the philosophy of historical narratives, what they are, and how we can teach this type of historical thinking that recognizes the potency of narrative.